Business models are usually measuring, depending on the stage they're in, either profitability or revenue. Um, and in DoD can be uncomfortable in some audiences, but their lethality is like the thing. And from that, you can derive all of the other sub metrics that you would see in commercial, like CAC to LTV ratios and all of these things. So then it's like, okay, well, for this particular aspect of the mission, what does lethality mean? Well, it means we have to be able to quickly ascertain what targets are out there, build a list of those targets, and plan against them. And just like you would on a factory floor, that is essentially a knowledge work factory that results in a kinetic outcome, but it's knowledge work, and you have to figure out what are the bottlenecks in that, in the same way you would with a um, assembly line. And identifying which is the biggest bottleneck can be a lot more difficult because, as you said, it's not always math, but a lot of times it actually does get reduced to math. It's like, okay, well, we need to be able to produce this list in 1 hour. What does it take to produce this list? Well, we have to do, well, today it takes 20 minutes to build that. All right, why don't we have a machine do that and it can build it in one? Did I And then the question becomes, just like in a factory floor, did I globally optimize or locally optimize? Because you might reduce that to 1 minute, but you don't actually change the overall thing, right? Because you could produce the list faster, but nobody can do anything with the list. So it's like, oh, that wasn't the bottleneck. And I think if people systematically go through in a theory of constraints sort of way, identifying the bottleneck and subordinating everything to it and solving for it, uh, that's where you start to get the mission metrics. And I would go back to lean analytics on this. Is there should always be one mission metric that matters. And then they, of course, brought in the OODA loop, which for any of my Air Force folks on the phone and DoD in general, we're all very familiar with Boyd's OODA loop and how that relates to the Deming cycle. And fun fact, by the way, if you didn't know, there's this whole train of thought where Boyd, he goes through a lot of the famous lean thinkers, one of them being Deming, and almost writes his own novel in the margins of some of these books about like lean Toyota manufacturing and Deming. So there's a lot of interplay between Deming, DevOps, and the OODA loop, strangely enough. But ultimately, what it comes down to is that we need to employ the scientific method, right? And the biggest challenges to adopting a scientific approach, right, taking an observation, creating a hypothesis, and testing it, is culture and experience. And those are hard things to solve at the same time. It's like usually to solve a culture issue, you have to change behaviors, you have to know what you're doing. But in order to know what you're doing, you typically need the experience. And so it becomes a bit of a challenge. This gets a lot of groans in some of the forums that I talk in and teach in. But I think you call this like the user's hierarchy of needs. The idea that it needs to be feasible, valuable, usable, and delightful, or easy to use, have a great user experience. I think there's been a lot of misconception around like what is an MVP, but maybe if I boiled it down, I would say it comes down to this, right? We want to slice vertically on the user's hierarchy of needs rather than horizontally. So traditionally in a waterfall project, we're building the whole system all at once over the course of 5, or in some DoD cases, 8, 10 years. And we slowly build up to like, okay, this is valuable. Let's make it usable. Let's make it delightful. And the problem is usually program funding gets cut or they run into technical or architectural challenges and it stops somewhere. Usually it's still not usable and it still ends up getting delivered to the field. And that we would be much better off if we built smaller slices of capability and made sure that when we delivered them, they were usable and delightful. And then slicing right. Because the other thing that happens is once you deliver a crappy product like we see in most waterfall delivery, the funding gets cut. And then you don't ever have a chance to go back and make it usable or delightful. And I think we've all experienced that in our missions. So, and then you see again here, there's when you're doing that, it's important to have one key metric that matters. And another important thing is that should change over time. In other words, you should start slicing right. because the corollary to this and why there's a lot of groans is MVP has become this overused term where you end up with a development team that exists on forever, just like a zombie waterfall project. And they're constantly optimizing this thin slice of value instead of moving across the value stream and providing more and more like large scale blue ocean value. And so you got to make sure you don't have your blinders on. You got to make sure you're looking across the value stream and saying, what's the most important metric right now? And it's not going to be the one that you started with 2 years ago.